the evolving security environment, lessons from recent Russian operations. And the chair of the panel is Robert Baines, president of the NATO Association of Canada and the executive director of the Canadian Albania Business Council. He's extensive experience working with NATO issues and the Canadian defense establishment. He's a member of the Armed Forces Reserve, serves with the Toronto Scottish right now, I just found out, but he's walking across Lakeshore Boulevard and he's joining the Navy. So, naval intelligence. So good luck. So Robert, I'll let you go ahead and introduce your panel.
Thanks so much, General.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. As the General mentioned, I run the NATO Association of Canada, and we're pleased to be always partnering with Mackenzie Institute, a very important partnership. It's our job specifically to make sure that Canadians understand the value of security and then how NATO helps to provide that security. It's an amazing organization, just like the Mackenzie Institute. I hope you can come to some of our events as well. What we're here to talk about this panel is a little bit about explaining what the conflict currently is in Europe. And by better understanding what conflicts have been and where we have perhaps failed to prevent conflicts, namely Crimea, that gives us an idea of how peacekeeping should perhaps go on the way forward. What we want to do is to make sure that we understand what are the threats and how do we get in ahead of those threats. Specifically, after the Second World War, NATO was created, the UN was created, a lot of multilateral institutions were brought about in order to make sure that large-scale military conflict does not happen again. There are many ways that this can happen. NATO is one of them through deterrence, and we want to just discuss the different ways that the idea of peacekeeping, preventing war, how those ideas can be on a bit of a continuum and how there are many players to be active in this area and with the eventual goal of making sure that peace is maintained not only in Europe but of course globally. But Europe has traditionally been such a hot spot. Up until 70 years ago, there has been ceaseless conflict, generation after generation. And what we've been able to do in the past 70 years is halt that progress of conflict. We want to make sure that this is maintained, that it continues. NATO is, of course, a big piece of the picture there, but there are many other organizations that can be involved. The OSCE, the OECD, the UN, of course, in stemming this conflict. So we have today a great panel. What we're going to do is talk until about 11:15 or so with our fine panelists here, who I will introduce in a moment. And then we'll give about 45 minutes for questions from the floor. We're expecting a very freewheeling conversation. We want this to be more of an exchange rather than just shouting words at you. We want to make sure that there's a real warm discussion. So, if I may introduce the panel to my left is James Poborsa. He is the co-editor-in-chief of the NATO Association of Canada. He has been in this role for a year now, but has been involved in NATO issues specifically for about 3, going on 4, I guess now. His background is specifically in China, but he does have a significant amount of experience in all that we're talking about today. To his left, we have Lieutenant Colonel Agris Ozoliņš. He has been the defense attaché of Latvian Canada, has been extremely involved with most of the events here at the Mackenzie Institute and the NATO Association as well. He has the absolute honor of being able to be one of our main go-betweens with the Latvian government, which is, of course, our host at the moment with 455 troops. So his role in all of this is really on the front lines. When we're talking about communication, we're talking about making sure that we've got information sharing, that we're all on the same page with our allies. The Colonel is really right there, and it'll be wonderful to be able to hear his opinion on some of the issues we're going to talk about. To the Colonel's left, you're right, Kenneth Geers has 10 years experience in the former Soviet Union, specifically in Estonia and the Ukraine. Cyber is his game. He's got that issue closed up in a box for us here, so we'll be able to discuss back and forth not only academic, military, but also the cyber aspect as well. So I think we've got a very good breadth in our panel, and we will begin forthwith. And we just wanted to start off with some general comments from all of our panelists regarding the general security environment, specifically with Russia, but in Europe generally, and what it might look like in the next few years. What are some of the trends? What are some of the issues that we have to look out for? So if we can start from James and go down, just a few minutes of what you think the next few years might look like.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me here today. In terms of the key issues facing Europe, certainly it's interference operations, information warfare, disinformation, and the undermining of popular national sovereignty and national perceptions of the efficacy and importance of their own governments in communicating the success of peace and stability and deterrence operations for NATO specifically, is one of the major and core areas where I see that NATO has to work effectively, as well as various national governments. Internationally, obviously, various militaries and great powers are modernizing their militaries. Certainly the area I work on is China. That very much is the case. They have a long-term strategy towards 2050. The Russians are also currently in a military modernization program and spending quite heavily in that capacity. But as the Minister mentioned earlier, one of the key issues certainly facing Canada is the threat of non-state actors, the threat of lone wolf terrorism, the threat certainly of the 60 publicly identified, or at least known, individuals returning to Canada who have fought in Syria and Iraq. But one of the key areas I wanted to discuss today with our panelists, and I think that perhaps will be fruitful for the audience, is to really examine the manipulation of the media, of social media, and how the long-term norm that the media was the arbiter, not necessarily of truth, but of non-biased or progressive reporting on key national security issues, certainly, and how that's being undermined is, I think, one of the key threats facing open, liberal, democratic societies today.
Good morning. Thank you for having me on this panel. It's really an honor for me. Looking on a history, today is the 30th of November, and it's back in 1939, Soviet Union attacked Finland and started the Winter War. It's a history, right? And it was 1956 when Soviet Union suppressed uprising in Hungary, and in '68 it happened with the Czech Republic, and then it was invasion in Afghanistan, and then it was Ukraine and Georgia in 2008 and Ukraine in 2014. So we see is that the military threat is all still around Europe, and essence of war didn't change just tools. From my perspective, it's the same war, just using different tools, using social media, using electronic warfare, and other new technologies, UAVs, long-range, high-precision weapons, and so on and so on. It's just getting worse when we look on all the tools which are in Russia's toolbox. What really matters, it's a unity of Europe, unity of European countries, and that's what we see. What I see in Europe right now, it's a different trends to split Europe, not through the NATO, also to the NATO, but more through the European Union. So we see a trend to split Europe. Brexit is just one example. Then it's the elections in France, and from this perspective, I look very carefully on our Latvian elections, which are next year. So it's more complicated than just the weapons, but it doesn't exclude the use of military. We'll talk a bit more about Zapad and the lessons later, but the general observation is that it's a capability in Europe to get together a really large force, not only in Europe, but from north, high north to the Black Sea, and deploy a military force in long distances. So, and that's in a combination with a propaganda, with disinformation, cyber, etc. So that's my major concern, and I will hand over.
If you want to try that microphone as well. Nope.
Not sure. So I'll go ahead and speak through this one for the moment. Thanks for having me. Yeah, so I have some experience over the past decade in the former Soviet Union. I started in Soviet studies in the United States in 1987 as well, and eventually came back to it. I was a lucky analyst in 2007 when the Estonian president was at the White House, and I got a call from the Pentagon, and they said, would you move to Estonia to help build a cyber center for NATO? So I was the first international researcher there a year before it opened, and now it's over 20 nation states are members with full-time staff. So cyber has rocketed to the top, I think, if you think about the impact of information technology on the planet, it's truly hard to fathom, I think. And nobody's mentioned it, I don't think, yet today, so I'll just mention the 2016 U.S. presidential election. I think we still don't even quite understand what happened. In terms of, and I'll only say this, the impact of IT on everything we do, right? Including, so if you look at it this way, when Bill Clinton named 8 critical infrastructures in the mid 1990s, it was water, finance, electricity, etc. Well, the democratic process wasn't one of them, but probably be included today. And so, moved to Estonia. I did in 2007 to help respond to the cyber attacks, and then I moved to Ukraine, where there was also a conflict, real and cyber, with Russia, and much more serious. If you look at the harder numbers in Ukraine, it's over 10,000 dead and over 1 million displaced. Those are the real telling numbers about what Moscow is thinking. But in cyberspace, if you compare 2007 to 2014, there was a massive evolution in cyber tactics. So Estonia was mainly about a denial of service against some websites. In Ukraine, we're talking in diplomacy and politics and business and social media and critical infrastructure on the battlefield and far away from Ukraine. Cyber attacks that weren't necessarily decisive in any sense of the word, but ubiquitous and very intimate, in that now they're all sort of micro-targeting, right, of people via smart devices in your pocket. So that's one, I think, the social media side, and the other, back to the critical infrastructure. Everyone was waiting for someone to turn the lights out in cyberspace, right, on a city. And we've seen the first incidents of that in Ukraine. We know the connectivity is there and the vulnerability is there as far as internet-connected critical infrastructure. And so that's one area where we have seen Ukraine play its role in the history of warfare, and cyber warfare in particular, demonstrating that is possible, and it won't be the last time that happens.
So that already starts moving into our second question a little bit, where we want to talk a bit about specifically how Russia is giving us these challenges to NATO, to the post-war order, the rules-based consensus, essentially. Clearly in 2014 in Ukraine with Crimea, this was the one situation where a lot of people who are in Europe and North America started really saying, well, you can't do that anymore. We can't You don't just take other parts of another country. This is the 21st century. There were a lot of memes on that subject, a lot of cries that not in the 21st century, you don't use 19th century tactics. Well, they did, and it kind of worked. So what are some of the main challenges that are posed by Russia, both this new generation warfare, both the cyber and the kinetic aspect of it? And is it a cohesive thing? Is it new? James, I know you've got some points on that specifically.
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to address that. So collectively, NATO member states spend 70% of global defense spending. That is a massive number. It is certainly the largest percentage internationally. And Russia is very aware of that. And they know that in a conventional sense, they don't pose the same threat as NATO does. And mind you, NATO is obviously a deterrence posture entity. It's primarily there to ensure peace and stability as well as economic prosperity for its various member states. So in response to that, the term new generation warfare, and it's often conflated with this idea of a Gerasimov doctrine, and I'll address that in a minute, but it's essentially a strategy of influence rather than one of conventional force. One of the major goals is to undermine open liberal democracies, often through what's called a gray zone strategy, or a strategy of antagonism between the space of war and peace. Which seeks to manipulate public perceptions of trust in the nation state that's being targeted, as well as peace and stability, and thereby undermines public confidence in national governments. So it's essentially the effort towards promoting regime change through asymmetric tactics. The U.S. Army Asymmetric Warfare Group last year published an excellent report detailing, with a great degree of specificity, Russian military capabilities and asymmetric capabilities, certainly surrounding this concept of new generation warfare. And so one of the major misconceptions is that it was the result of a report or an article written by Valery Gerasimov, who is the chief of the Russian General Defense Staff, and who in 2013 in the Military Industrial Courier published an article that generally outlined Russia's response to hybrid tactics as practiced by the United States. And that was taken by many in the media, certainly, and then promoted quite heavily within the sort of policy and analytics circles as being indication that Russia had this sort of coherent, cohesive, and generally forward-thinking military doctrine that would then see its deployability in a particular operational context, and that certainly was the annexation of Korea. I was speaking last night with Professor Walter Dorn, who teaches at the Canadian Forces College, and his primary way of articulating the problem vis-a-vis Russia was the question of deceit. Certainly when they annexed Crimea, they didn't invade with a military. They sent burly, strong guys to the guard posts at various military garrisons, who essentially said, we have a much larger force backing us up. You should stand down now. And so from a jus in bello perspective, from the perspective of the law of war and what's called international humanitarian law, you don't have the right to fire on these people. So there's this threat perception that there is this broader force in reserve, which does have the capacity to take out a particular military. And so that particular strategy was, in certainly Crimea, very effective. There's the broad, I think, misperception that in eastern Ukraine, via Russia's support for proxy fighters, that it primarily was this sort of similar asymmetric tactic, when it wasn't. Russia used primarily, or at least the fighters with the support of Russia, used conventional military power. They used artillery, they used armor, they used drones, as well as electronic warfare. So as one analyst has argued, and this is a key Russia analyst, it's about breaking the internal coherence of the enemy system and not about its integral annihilation. So it's really about eroding and destabilizing trust in the ability of a government to protect its citizens, which then can lead to social fragmentation, and in the case of Eastern Europe, certainly ethnocentric fragmentation. And that's long been a strategy of the Russians to divide various Eastern European populations along ethnic lines, certainly as regards the Russian population. Perhaps the Lieutenant Colonel could speak more to that in operational context.
And Agris, specifically, how does NATO's conventional superiority, does these tactics and specifically the whole strategy of Russia, does it level the playing field, a significant amount?
Thank you. First of all, Crimea was a unique thing, and it will not repeat, and that's the essence of Gerasimov's doctrine or hybrid warfare. So other places it will work differently. So we don't know what might be the next one. If you look on a forces on a force layout, it was I remember in our defense academy when we learned blue to red, and if we put together numbers and statistics, so yes, NATO has a more tanks, more airplanes, more warships, and everything, but that's in a very large area. If you look on a tiny Baltics, for example, which is a Russian zone of interest, then the force ratio is totally different, and they have overwhelming power. However, we are not saying all true. So RAND in 2016 published a paper where they said that Baltics can be invaded in 60 hours. That's not like that. Mathematics are different, especially after Zapad. In 20 hours, they may be in Berlin or be in Warsaw. So that's a real capabilities. If you look on a force ratio, if you look on the countries after a Cold War, in European countries, we reduced forces. Latvia was kind of maintaining, but the big European countries were reducing forces. In the Netherlands, there are no tanks anymore, none. For example, and Brits are building a air carrier, but there are no airplanes. So mathematics are different, and we have to be honest. We can gather a large conventional force and fight a battle, but we are not ready now. And Russia knows that very much, and they play hard. They are playing for power position. If you look, if you look on the mindset of most of Russians, I would say they like power. If you are weak, they will dominate. And if you want to have dialogue, you must be powerful. You must be able to fight back. That's like in ice hockey. Why Russia respects Canada? Because you are good in hockey. That's just one of the examples, right? So, and our strength is not a military capability right now in a Baltics and Poland. The NATO strength now is a unity. Once again, we have 17 countries right now deployed troops, and numbers are very small to compare with Russia, but they are big enough to deter, to show a will, to show a unity, to show that we believe in agreements we signed. It's not like Russia signed a peace agreement with Latvia in 1920 and 20 years later invaded, or Budapest memorandum regarding territorial integrity of Ukraine. So for them, these papers doesn't mean much. The power is essential. So in a Western world, we believe in treaties we signed, and we do what we agreed to do, right? And I see that in Canada every day as well. So our strength, once again, is in unity, not in the military numbers. If we will have 10 brigades in the Baltics, that might be significant force, but then that may be considered as a threat next to the borders. But the small units work. If you look back on Western Berlin in a Cold War time, there were 3 brigades in Western Berlin, surrounded by 30 or 40,000 Russian and Eastern German troops. So was that a force ratio was sufficient to protect West Berlin? Likely not. But unity worked. So big influential countries were there and saying that's what we stand for. We stand for common values and treaties we signed. So
that's a bit more of the conventional military heft. But Kenneth, can you give us a bit more of a sense of how does the land lie for the cyber situation? Are we evenly matched? Is Russia putting way more emphasis and resources into cyber war? How is that looking?
So I think that it's interesting. The Napoleon and Hitler found that Russia has enormous strategic depth in in traditional space, right? Traditional geography. Actually, I think the true in cyberspace, it's flipped. I think in that ultimately the cyberspace looks a lot more like democracy than it does autocracy. It's true that it's a good tool for surveillance, and it's a good tool for information operations and chicanery and attacks. That's true. But ultimately, I think the tight political control means tight information control, which means that from an attacker's perspective, it should be easier to surveil, shut down, and manipulate in the event of real conflict. I think Putin knows that he's playing with fire as well, with cyber attacks, because the internet can turn on him or any other dictator very quickly. And I couldn't agree more that the unity is so important relative to the alliance. But also, when you think about cybersecurity, it's fundamentally an international problem that requires an international solution. So I think that the alliance is ideally suited to move forward in the internet era because the power of IT. You think about Luxembourg. Luxembourg has something like 350 soldiers, right? I bet you they have, because of the banking sector, they have far more information technology specialists, even security specialists than that. So I think the smaller countries, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and Iceland, they can play a powerful role, I think, in the future of the security of the alliance. Because everything is asymmetric in cyber. We know that in the internet. You can copy a file 1 million times over for nothing. Storage is becoming nearly free. That's not to say that its future is all rosy on the internet. There's still a lot of challenges. But in general, I think it's the IT and cyber and the internet have been positive influences on human history. And that we're moving in the right direction. So vis-a-vis Russia, I think we need to be smart and wise, not overreact, but also unity is key. Information sharing, both proactive and reactive for cyber best practices, but also investigations into attacks, transparency. I also do some work for the OSCE, which kind of covers almost the whole northern hemisphere. And we have worked on some CBMs, or confidence building measures for cyberspace. And all of them have the word voluntary in it, but I think they also have transparency is probably really the key word. And so you know what a nation's policies, laws, guidelines are, and points of contact. And that's really key. And so those are some general thoughts, but I think that in general we need to avoid overreacting to screw up the internet because it's a positive influence. But I think the more we work together on this issue, and even the smaller players can play a surprisingly big role.
Yeah. James?
Actually, I did have a follow-up to that. One of the key things we're seeing internationally is in a way, the balkanization of the internet. We're seeing Russia now, the former Minister of Telecommunications, now a key advisor to Vladimir Putin, looking to diminish the U.S.'s control over the civilian internet infrastructure in the U.S. To create their own internal networks whereby they can control that space. Certainly in the case of my research, that's very much the case for China. In order to get online, you have to register your passport or your identity card in China. So they know who you are, what you're looking at, where you're looking at it from, by virtue of that registration process. Unlike, say, the open internet here in Canada, where everybody has sort of unmitigated access to any information, which obviously can be surveilled. But ostensibly, from your perspective, how might that further erode the openness of the internet Is that a feasible objective for various nation states? Certainly, I think it shouldn't be. But given that that's the tendency that's currently ongoing, how do you see that possibly unfolding?
Yeah, so there's the halal internet and the Great Wall of China and RUNET, so I have some perspective on this because I still teach in Ukraine. So I talk to my students about this somewhat frequently because in Ukraine now they're trying to outlaw Russian social media and such, which they have reason to because of all the information operations and hostile propaganda. But the question is whether you try to censor it, and the problem is I've done a study also on censoring the internet, and that's hard. It's hard to do because it's censorship almost by definition leads to over censorship, right? You're trying to ban a particular word, but then you get all kinds of other concepts that the word could mean, and then people just tend to misspell what you've censored, right? So that they get. So that their meaning comes right through. It's very hard to do. In the same way, I think China and Russia and Iran, if they try and wall themselves off from the internet, one, they're going to be shooting themselves in the foot. Two, I don't think it's perhaps physically possible to do, given how wily humans are, right, in terms of getting information. So I've studied this in the Middle East as well, censorship and the use of proxies and satellites and rerouting communications in order to get what you want. So again, I'll say that these are huge problems for sure. There's no doubt about it. But we have to. I encourage unity, especially in the context of the alliance. I think the EU and NATO will play very important roles in the future of the internet. And so I think we should both technically and logically promote diversity and transparency and unity, right? And be a role model for the world. And I think that's what Moscow is most afraid of, is that NATO is not about to attack Moscow, right? I think the threat from the Kremlin's perspective is that it's an attractive role model for young Muscovites, right, rather than what the Kremlin has to offer.
So we did discuss a little bit in our back and forth about these questions that we did want to bring in the peacekeeping aspect to this, and I'd like to hear your comments on mitigation of conflict. All three of you have just been talking about unity and how that is perhaps one of the greatest assets of NATO and the EU itself. By guaranteeing mutual defense, NATO has provided a significant deterrent to possible conflict. And while not identified as peacekeeping, as I mentioned before, the solidarity and credibility of NATO's security guarantee has kept relative peace in Europe for almost 70 years. Is this concept of peace through strength a message that Canadians might support as a useful extension of the Canadian peacekeeper myth? It's something that Pearson was always involved with, was that you can't have peace without strength. And so is this something that we should be talking more about, perhaps, as a new way forward to make sure that people understand that peace comes through strength?
Sure, I'll take that on first. From an academic perspective, that's purely about the symbolic projection of power. I mean, that's where NATO's deterrence capacity has historically lied, not in actual ready forces that are deployed, and certainly in the forward presence we now have. Historically, it's all been about operational capacity and planning and unity. And so to deal with many of the emergent threats at the Wales Summit in 2014, a readiness action plan was agreed upon, which entailed assurance measures, so increased military activity for assurance and deterrence, as well as adaptation measures. And this is key. It's how NATO adapted to the emergent problem. And certainly when it comes to peacekeeping, I think we're really talking about peace enforcing in transnational context, but certainly with Eastern Europe. And so one of the measures adopted was the increase of the NATO response force, the NRF, to make it more responsive and capable, from 13,000 troops to about 40,000 troops. So it's a massive increase in the sheer number of forces that are capable of being deployed, as well as the foundation of the Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, which was also agreed upon at the Wales Summit, which is a multinational brigade of roughly 5,000 troops and generally seen as a spearhead force capable of responding within 48 hours. And the Colonel had mentioned earlier that that RAND report did indicate that within 60 hours Russia could have complete control over various bordering states. And again, I think that perhaps was exaggerated, although mind you, I'm no military planning specialist in that capacity. But I think NATO, through its ongoing initiatives, both diplomatically as well as militarily, has sought to address the threat and has sought to bring together a wide array of multinational actors and assure commitments from its partner nations to mitigate any potential future conflict.
Peacekeeping is very important. Everything in the world is connected. So that's so simple for me and the military perspective. If you look on a peace in Europe, it's been long-lasting, but we failed in the Balkans somehow. I mean, European Union. So we still needed the larger force and more decisive actions being conducted there, and that's our weakness. It's a decision making is a weakness. Decisions are taking a long time. That's also on the Ukrainian side. In 2008 in Georgia, when war with Russia invaded Georgia. So I believe that decision making is too slow. So we can be more proactive and deploy troops or assist countries where the peace preservation is needed before conflict, not classically where after conflict, but even before conflict. Latvia participates in a peacekeeping operations within means and capabilities we can, and we understand that everything in the world is connected. So,
Do you have any comments?
Do you have any?
Well, yeah, sure. I don't know. I'm just reading Ahmed Rashid's book, Descent into Chaos, right now. It could hardly be more depressing. Is sort of dealing with, the post-military operations in Afghanistan and in Iraq too. Yeah, you have to, peacekeeping is, when you invade a country, it's when you engage on any aggressive action, you have to plan for the aftermath, and plan for the future, which is harder. What we do know about the world though today is that with the internet, we have laid the foundation, just like railroad tracks in the 1800s. We've laid the foundation now for a truly global and international space. So that's for sure. When you look at code, when you look at applications, operating systems, these are inherently international creations. And again, I'll go back to my students in Ukraine. They're dealing with this law that outlaws Russian sites, but that's where so many of their friends and language are. So then they use proxies and they find other ways to get to it. But really, they're very attracted to they're very attracted to Facebook, for example. They grew up with Kontakte, but they're moving to Facebook because of English, because of the international flavor of it, and perhaps the sense that it's represents an international standard, right? Something for them to draw on that's less parochial and more future and fear oriented in some sense. Don't want to give Facebook too much credit. But yeah, so one of the things we need to do probably is to be better communicators. We know I know from my 20 years in the U.S. government that we don't. There's a very, very powerful. There's a focus on blowing things up, killing people and breaking things, right? And less so on understanding, less so even if you look at the offensive firepower, less so on language and culture and understanding and so on and so forth. And so that's, when you go into a country, I mean, Iraq and Afghanistan stand as stark reminders to us that you can lose everything very quickly that you've invested in unless you plan for the long term and the hard part, right? Which is, and that's why, for example, Russia invasion of Ukraine, is ultimately not in Russia's interest, and even probably so, Putin as well is at a loss to figure out what to do next, right? Invading a country is easy. Figuring out how to benefit from it is much harder.
James, you got
I'm glad you did mention that. I mean, that is a key issue for diplomacy and for development assistance in the aftermath of conflict. I mean, NATO and its allies are, and certainly the U.S. and also Canada, are tremendously successful at the tactical and operational level, and also at the strategic level. But when it comes to what's often called the whole of government approach, to ensuring that funding cycles aren't simply short-term, but that even if there is no funding, you can guarantee for the long term. And so an example of that is when I was in Afghanistan, I documented CETA-funded sites that were completely derelict. There was no long-term plan to ramp up local programming. And so the money was there, but it was not a long-term and sustainable program. So we spent all this money. It helped a few people for a few months or for a year or two, but then essentially the programs disappeared because there wasn't local capacity to continue rolling it out. The same also obviously is the case in Libya. We were very successful at stopping Gaddafi's army, but we were less successful at securing the massive weapons stockpiles that he had amassed, which has since destabilized much of the Maghreb. AQIM took a substantial portion. Various militias in Libya also established their own various fiefdoms. And because of that, we've seen destabilization as far south as Cameroon, in the Central African Republic, in Mali, Niger, etc. And that's a long-term issue as a result of what was a very near-term and noble response to, in an R2P context, a very nefarious regime.
Yeah. So we've already discussed a fair amount about the importance of unity, and what I did want to move to is we've got a number of questions that we had, a few of you had mentioned that you'd like to discuss, but it's all about information warfare and the creating of wedges between allies, between different organizations. What do you see as the most important aspect of this? Like, what has this brought about? What's the most concerning effect of the information warfare that specifically Russia is really waging on all of Europe and North America? Kenneth, you want to start with that?
Well, again, I'll say that I'm very pro-NATO in that I think it's a false equivalency to suggest that the Kremlin's opinion is equal to that of NATO, right? NATO is 29 sovereign democracies, and the Kremlin is run by a very small group of narrow-minded, intelligence personnel, and so. I would say it's hard to know what to do in the face of hostile information operations and propaganda, and that's probably a societal question for the West, right? Like in the United States, as an American, I guess I should say something about that. It needs to be addressed inwardly in terms of understanding yourself as well as the enemy, and how to protect the country. So we have campaign finance reform, we have term limits, and political issues that we need to solve that are going to be relatively easy for hostile actors, in this case the Russians, to leverage. Because they are existing conflicts that exist, And all you have to do is insert the loaded language into the right micro-targeted population, and you have a conflict that is ready for exploitation. It's been ready for exploitation, and so that's a question for Americans to answer and to solve. That nobody dropped a bomb on Madison, Wisconsin, right? But almost surely information operations were sent to Madison, Wisconsin from Moscow, right? And so that is something almost certainly for Americans to answer for themselves.
But what do you find is the most dangerous aspect of information warfare?
Well, I mean, there's both a hard and soft power dimension, I think. But in terms of in the military side of things, there is a spectrum of information operations, some of which will focus on even very tactical units. And if it comes to war, they one of the things about cyber attacks is that they will they'll come in both terms of exploits in taking over machines. The internet or computers are machines, but cyberspace is in the human mind, right? And so there's an interplay there. That is difficult to defend because you can go after either. And when you join the U.S. Army now, out of high school, they'll give you a pair of boots, and they'll give you battle fatigues and also books, field manuals. And the current field manuals, you should read them. They discuss cyber attacks as can help to take real ground, can substantially affect decision-making of the adversary, both in war and in peace, right? So, and that's the way it is now. And I think one of the ways to think about cyber war is that most of the work is going to be done during peacetime, right? And so that's key to understanding cyber war. When the shooting starts, it's kind of too late, things are going to be moving maybe too quickly. And you've already made the main decisions. But if you want to be ready for war or cyber war, most of your attacking and subversion is going to have to be done during a time of peace. And so that's very interesting. It creates a really chaotic space, like on any given day, like today. There's going to be not only information operations that are designed to affect voters or national decision making, but also a lot of intrusions that are meant to undermine the security of weapon systems and the personnel who fire those weapon systems in the event of war. And certainly, for example, vis-a-vis China and Russia, this is going to happen every day, all the time, right? Because there's always the threat that there might be war in the Pacific or war in with Russia. So you've got to get ready for that. In order to do that, you have to exploit systems. I mean, look at the F-35 project in the States, probably the most expensive program in U.S. history, well known for being a juicy target for attackers in the design phase, in the testing phase, deployment phase, etc. And so it's the big question is then when war may happen 5 years from now in the Pacific and the pilot pulls the trigger, nothing might happen, right? Because essentially the program has been subverted many years before.
Agris, specifically with the Latvian contingent and situation with the battle group there, what do you see as the greatest concerning effect of information warfare?
We are constantly living in Latvia in information warfare. So we are targeted, the Latvians and ethnic Russians living in Latvians are targeted every day. And so we are already getting kind of immune towards all the propaganda and the messages. And what we see in regards to enhanced forward presence battle group is we are targeted. We are targets again. So everything what's being said bad about the Canadian troops or Allied troops, it's we are targets, not your troops. Domestic audience in Latvia is a target, and that is to change a mind, and that's one of the indications of preparation for war. So you prepare battle space on information domain. You get more local support, fifth column, if I may say it like that. So we are target. I don't see in Canada the big echo on propaganda, which is on different media type publications or social media. It's all about target Latvian domestic audience. Where we are weak, we are not having enough proactivity. So we are responding. We're responding. We are responding with the true. We are revealing the true and telling a real story. But that's a reaction on attacks. We are not making it true first. We are trying to do that, but we are not effective enough. The same, I believe, the same is Estonia and Lithuania. The target is a local population, not the NATO troops. For example, in Lithuania, the Germans are lead nation and EFP battle group. When Germans arrived in Lithuania, they disseminated posters where Germans were equalized as Nazi German troops, so saying that Nazi Germany is back. But that's target is domestic audience. It's not about Germans. So Germans probably take in account, but really Lithuanian domestic auditorium audience is a target. So they start to think if there are any similarities. So right.
James, what do you see as the most concerning effect?
Yeah, I can give two recent examples from the Canadian context as part of EFP. So there are three major news stories that were circulating in Latvia specifically. One of which was that Canadian troops were being housed in luxury housing. Another was that they were littering, and another was that there was a former colonel in the Canadian forces based at Trenton who had committed some horrendous crimes, and that was indicative of the sort of broader culture within the Canadian military. And that's purposely designed to undermine the credibility not only of the Canadian forces, but of our multinational leadership capabilities. So certainly it's incumbent upon NATO to counter that, and as well as amongst international communities to counter disinformation generally. It doesn't help that the current US president constantly writes that the actual real news is fake news, which undermines public perceptions and what counts as valid investigative journalism. And certainly the Washington Post, the New York Times, key, very productive, very well-informed, and certainly very, in many ways, nonpartisan journalistic outlets are being targeted. But one of the key factors is state-sponsored media from other nations. That includes Russia Today and Sputnik, which the U.S. recently forced to register as foreign agents. Those sorts of organizations tend to be taken as credible. The comparison certainly in Russia is that while Canada has the CBC, they're a national broadcaster, should they then also be seen as a foreign adversarial media or propaganda outlet? Obviously in Canada that's not the case, thankfully. We have a very open generally nonpartisan media sphere, but fundamentally that's one of the major actors, is really the balkanization of the media, the destabilization of public perceptions in the role of the media to actually tell the truth and report the facts, and the increasing polemicization of the media sphere. That's happening here, and that's being exploited as a key tool to undermine the way in which generally less informed target citizens are being targeted with misinformation. And so a good example of that came out of the U.S. recently. During the last election cycle, U.S. veterans were specifically targeted through membership organizations that they had joined online. There's an excellent report that details how Facebook was one of the key arbiters of Russian misinformation about not only the U.S. military, but about the international militaries which they're combating. And so that I think is a persistent area that needs to be not only further researched, but made known to the public. And public outreach is a key factor in that analysis.
So since 2014, and specifically the annexation of Crimea, NATO has done a significant amount, specifically at Wales and then also at the Warsaw Summit, to try to make sure that the alliance is prepared for similar tactics, asymmetric warfare itself, and the new generation warfare, as it were. Has it been enough? The enhanced forward presence, the response force, the alignment to making sure that the United States, of course, is dedicated to Article 5 in the most basic way, i.e. the President of the United States saying that he will honor Article 5 coming out of his own mouth. Is this enough? Are we in an okay spot at the moment if the new generation warfare was tried again in Lithuania, Latvia, or Estonia, for instance? Agris, if you want to start with that.
Right. I already mentioned that what we have in EFP in the Baltics and Poland, that it's enough not to deter and not to provoke Russia. I'm more, and most of Latvians are more concerned about what's our future. What's our future? We live with a neighbor in the east for a very long time, and how we will live for next decades or next centuries. So if you look on life after Putin, so he will not rule forever. No one lives forever, and we need to understand how to make relations again and how to start a dialogue. And I already mentioned that they understand the power dialogue. So we need to be very smart to find the right buttons to push and press, and for a discussion. Once again, I don't think it's enough military assets now in Europe, but we are lacking a dialogue. We need to talk in a different formats. It may be NATO Russia Council, it may be something bilateral, and on my understanding, that's a very big role might be for Canada in the future. Because you are very well respected, you have very good reputation as a military force. You've been in peacekeeping for decades, and so my concern is more about the future. Right now, we feel quite safe and because of our unity. But it once again, it's how we will discuss and how we will have a discussion with Russia in the future.
Yeah. Kenneth, you seem to be fairly happy with where we are as far as our freedom versus being able to protect ourselves as well. Is that the way you're feeling as far as if Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia are concerned? Are we doing enough if Russia really starts to put a little bit more pressure on the establishment of the internet?
Well, it's tough. I think, as with Ukraine, the Russians are likely to try and exploit the Russian minorities in Latvia and in Estonia. They love to use the word fascist and Nazi, etc., in Ukraine and Lithuania. So again, they're exploiting what they perceive to be traditional, pre-existing cleavages in society, and that's hard. That's hard to defend against. But specifically on cybersecurity, I think one of the things that we should see within the alliance is some bold proposals to increase cybersecurity specifically within the alliance, and I think other countries will follow, right? And in one area in particular, so cyber attack is cyber espionage is this thing that some people call computer network exploitation, right? It's essentially espionage. You're just stealing information for intelligence reports. And that's kind of seen to be okay, because espionage is okay under, you're just trying to defend your sovereignty and your law enforcement jurisdiction from threats. But the problem when you attack computers to steal information, you also are in position to manipulate the information. And that's a whole different policy and guidelines. That's why, like, for example, the difference between NSA, which does exploitation, and Cyber Command, which does attack, that's really rough. But that's why they're co-located. But it's the same skill sets, it's the same type of work, but it's two totally different things. In other words, if I'm reading your stock prices or your plan, your business proposals, that's one thing. If I alter them, that is a whole different ball game, right? And so that's attack. It's completely different guidelines, and it requires a national decision-making authority, right? So I think within the context of the alliance, one of the boldest things that we could and should see is some kind of agreements on limitations of cyber espionage within the alliance, within the EU, within NATO. And I think that's one of the really important things we could do moving forward, because computer network attack is really the evil twin of cyber espionage. They're kind of one and the same thing. If I'm in position to read all of your email, I'm in position also to change your emails, right? And tell the troops not to meet at midnight, but to meet at 2 in the morning. So they're all killed while they're still in their camp. So that's one of the things I could imagine seeing. And the thing is we have the assets to protect, we have, democracy to protect, we have an alliance. And so there would be peer pressure to keep the regime within the alliance, but also it would help to sort the wheat from the chaff, so you can see who the bad guys are who are coming into Berlin and Paris and Washington and London. And if you proactively and reactively work together, then it should create a safer cyberspace within the alliance and serve to help identify the truly bad actors trying to get in.
James, you have some comments?
Yeah, I mean, and that's primarily also a counterintelligence problem as well, and relies around issues of indication and warning analysis, how to understand what emerging threats are, how to plan for them, but also how to understand what adversarial states see as our core weaknesses or areas that can be, from their perspective, effectively exploited. And so within NATO, one of the key areas that's being addressed certainly is intelligence. Last year, an Assistant Secretary General for Intelligence and Security was appointed. He was formerly the head of the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the German BND, the German security services. But one of the core issues is multilateral and multinational intelligence sharing tends not to be effective because member states simply don't trust each other. So it gets to the point that you were talking about with regards to within NATO ramping up trust as well as intelligence sharing. 3 members of the Five Eyes are NATO member states who currently obviously share intelligence amongst each other. But when it comes to cyber exploits as well as cyber operations, there might be issues with sharing some of the exploit techniques with member states for fear that those states are themselves perhaps exploited by adversarial states. And so that becomes a key core counterintelligence problem that is circuitous and one that's very, very hard to predict and foresee. And I think that's one of the core issues that NATO needs to address. Certainly, Freitag von Loringhofen, a very hard German name to pronounce, and I speak German, who is currently the head of intelligence and security, needs to address and ultimately promote within the alliance.
We did have a number of other questions. I'm just going to stick with 3 because I'm conscious of the time. I know that there will be quite a few questions. The open door policy of NATO to enlargement. Agris, you've already mentioned this balance that we've got of not being, antagonistic, being able to say, okay, well, we're doing the most we can to be secure, but also not to be belligerent, essentially. The open door policy. Is this, the right balance? Being able to just say, well, anybody can join NATO if they want to. We're not going to automatically say no. The Secretary General of NATO reaffirmed that 2 weekends ago in Halifax. Is this a good idea? What is the dynamic between Russia's traditional sphere of influence? Should we care? How do we approach this?
From a historical perspective again, Russia needs a strategic depth. And it's historically been, if you look at the Napoleonic War, if you look at World War II, World War I, they always had this proxy states or near states near the border, which provided that strategic depth. And it's naturally understandable that Russia considers those states as a sphere of influence. However, we live in a world in the West that we are free in our decisions, and nations can decide where to work on, with which countries make relations, with which alliances make relations, and no one is saying Russia that they cannot make any relations with China or Brazil or South Africa or India. So I believe that it should be discussed, and it should be open discussion, but decisions are respective country decisions and NATO decisions. If countries are ready to join and willing to join, then it's normal. It happened in the past, and it's always been a border. Soviet Union had a border with NATO countries. So it's nothing really new. It's just one of excuses to trade for something. And in the 21st century, that strategic depth, in effect, military doesn't matter. So having a strategic airlift capabilities, long range, high precision weapons, and etc. is not such important anymore as it was in Napoleonic times or World War I, World War II. So I believe that's free countries and free decide where they go. And ironically, that Mr. Rogozin said about Russia possibility to join the alliance. It was like 10 years ago or something. On a question if Russia considers joining NATO, he answered like, Russia is not joining alliances, Russia is making alliances. So that just describes a power position.
Kenneth, James, do you have any comments on that at all?
Wait for a press for time.
Yeah. Excellent. Did want to mention the responsibility to protect. It is an issue Mr. McKay brought up, of course. Both Russia and the NATO alliance and the EU have come to mention the responsibility to protect as an important issue, as something, as a reason to get involved in an area. Russia, of course, is saying that their citizens are under threat in many different European countries. Just like to discuss this a little bit. How is this affecting the concept of the responsibility to protect? Is it a hindrance? The UN, of course, is still grappling with it in many different areas. How is the specific Russian situation with the responsibility to protect affecting this concept?
Yeah, I mean, R2P isn't codified in international law. It's simply an emergent norm, and so nation states do see it as incumbent upon them to protect citizens of other nation states who aren't being protected by their own national governments or who perhaps being aggressively attacked by them. But one of the core issues is the manipulation of R2P, the way in which non-state actors or state actors can draw other nation states into proxy conflicts under the guise of R2P. And that's something that certainly is ongoing in West Africa, withdrawing more international troops into that conflict and drawing out the alliance. And so other state actors can use proxy conflicts as a means by which to stretch an alliance, such as NATO, for instance, and expend resources as well as individual lives, which is the core component. And so from an international legal standpoint, I mean, certainly it's a noble doctrine that in many cases could or should be adopted by a UN resolution. But fundamentally, it's something that's open to the manipulation amongst the publics whom they perceive their governments are working towards helping.
Gentlemen, any comments? No. Okay. So the final question then. The defense review that we've had here in Canada, does it take the threat of hybrid warfare into account sufficiently? And what's the most important thing that Canada can do to ensure peace in Europe?
I mean, very briefly, it does. On page 53 of the Defense Policy Review, there's a paragraph that talks about gray zone strategies for hybrid war. But for the most part, it's not something that I don't think is necessarily top of mind. The DND has publicly said that they're ramping up cyber operations. Whether or not that entails the establishment of a cyber command, I'm not personally sure, as little information has been forthcoming for various obvious reasons. But certainly when it comes to asymmetric warfare, Canada has addressed the need to address the threat, but from a doctrinal standpoint, I'm not an expert on that, but from what I've read, I don't believe that's been the case. And certainly it's an area that should be addressed.
I'll just say, when we're updating doctrine, I think, in policy, somehow we have to include both the older, wiser, experienced voices, but the younger folks as well, because it is so hard to keep up, really. And that's the funny thing about Twitter, for example, is it's really annoying platform. But it seems like it's one of the only ways to keep up with news these days, because there's so much happening so fast. And so, and already, if you have children, like I do, who are in high school, it's hard to keep up with whatever they're doing. They move so quickly, and the platforms they use are different, and they don't use Facebook because it's for old people. And so somehow we're going to have to, again, evolve decision making and doctrine and policy writing, because experience is no longer, the history is changing too fast.
Probably I'm not in a position to discuss Canadian defense policy. But again, I see it's very balanced, and what I like, it's a covered, it's a high north challenges are. I see how they will be managed, and what is most important. I agree with the new things, which needs to be more. But I like that there is also a place for research and development and innovations. So.
Excellent. Okay, well, we're going to open the floor to questions. We have until, I believe, 12 o'clock. So, all right. Sir?
I'm not an expert. I'm an honorary of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry. We've been given the IA task for 4 Div. I've got to talk to Robert about joining the Navy, come and stay in the Army, but we'll talk about that afterwards. So there are movements being taking place. Our unit, for example, is doubling in size. Definition of soldiers can be very different. That's all good stuff. So there are steps being taken on that side. If anyone in the room knows good candidates, we have to recruit very quickly, so please see me at the end of the day. The question for the panel, and so the plug's over now, is the irony of all this is that the educational system throughout Canada, there's a focus on STEM. I get it wrong, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. And that's all very important, obviously, but we were talking about earlier about what can be done, or the comment that cyber is in the mind, that it's a very important concept, and the fact that we're talking one thing about censorship, what it can and can't do. The thing about that is that ultimately it comes down to the importance of critical thinking, and so the humanitarian or the humanities departments at the university have been complaining over the years, and rightly so, that there's no money going into those departments anymore. It's going to engineering or to business schools, and ultimately I think it comes down to the populace. If democracy is going to work, being able to critically work through issues. I'd just like the panel's comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I teach at the University of Toronto, and I'm also just finishing a PhD, and I do agree the humanities are being gutted. There are 10 positions in my field and 1,000 applicants. So it's not a great place right now to be in academia. And one of the core issues, too, is that the University of Toronto has an excellent array of students from around the world who bring various expertise and knowledge, as well as prejudices or backgrounds when it comes to their own perception of their own respective nation states. So I specifically teach Chinese history, Chinese foreign policy, and one of the core issues is, how people think about the international system versus how they think about their own system. And I'm a firm believer in track 2 diplomacy, people to people, educational, business to business interaction, and that's one of the core ways to build consensus, but also to build mutual understanding. And that only comes about when people critically reflect upon what the other side sees or thinks, why they think that, and what ultimately that can mean for bilateral, multilateral relations going forward. So certainly within the academy, as part of our core teaching component for our first and second year courses, we have a program that actually teaches students critical reading and writing skills, which is surprising for a university. Usually you would think you would learn that in high school, but some of my students come from authoritarian countries where critical thinking isn't necessarily part of the course. And I won't out those nation states, but I'm sure you can guess. One of the core problems is that that's seen in a way as a form of ideology. It's seen as a way of promoting a particular type of liberal internationalist soft power, and is often called in a way sort of, what's the term, sort of cultural imperialism, that often gets lambasted upon scholars who try and promote that sort of a narrative. And so I think that's a core issue going forward that should be addressed, that needs to be addressed. But again, people-to-people contact is the only way in which that's going to happen, in my esteem.
I fully agree that critical thinking is very necessary, and in Latvia we are moving towards a specific subject starting from primary school, which teaches more about critical thinking, some cyber awareness, also about core general values, and we call it like state defense program. And it's run in a close cooperation between MOD and Ministry of Education in Latvia. So we are trying to address that, to educate people from a very young age to look on all this information environment and on cyber environment and all the social networks with a more criticism that it is now. And of course it's an investment in a future. To make our this targeted propaganda towards us less effective, so just to protect our people, our population. So we cannot make propaganda against propaganda. We are going out with the truth and educating our people. So that's our approach.
I'll just mention that I just was at a conference in Berlin with there was some. Anyway, one senior person from Japan. So she was talking about the threat from North Korea, and I said, well, could North Korea, effectively use information operations against Japan? I said, given the culture and language, could they effectively do that? She said, well, I could identify a North Korean operation in Japanese information space. She said, but the average person couldn't. I thought that was an interesting comment.
Catherine.
Talking about controlling information, and in Canada we've had a lot of discussion about particularly cell phone companies and all the adjunctive services to broaden that. How do you feel about what's happening in the United States trying to repeal the set security issue there, which may have a big effect on other so-called democratic issues? My other question is looking at defense spending, as Peter was talking about, is that when we compare budgets, we don't compare the budgets of, say, Canada or the United States with their defense budgets, with huge components of that looking after veterans, looking after families, compared to the budget, say, for a private in China or a private in Russia. And how do you think we need to increase the information so our society, members of our society, understand that it's not just buying power equipment that our budgets cover as part of NATO. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't still be spending our 2%, but that people understand why that is necessary.
Yeah, no, I like your questions, and I'll try maybe to address both of them maybe together. I think that we do have to be smarter, right? We have all this, the power of information technology at our disposal, but yet it's going to be easy to mess it up, I think, and overreact and use it for, it's a tool, but we use it for in the wrong way, for politics, and for business. And I mean, if you surf the web now, it seems to me it's almost 95% of everything is one big man-in-the-middle attack, right? It's an advertiser or a politician or malware. I saw a Yale University study a couple of days ago that was published that said easily 75% of what you download is primarily intended to track you, right, and sell your information, right? That's the whole reason. That's the reason for Angry Birds. It's not to entertain you; it's to sell you, right? And so, so it's hard, and we need to really think about the how to address this wisely. And I mentioned Luxembourg earlier, but I think that small countries can really play an outsized role in helping to shape the new security space that we're in, maybe precisely because they're smaller. And then don't rely on, if I'm a hammer, everything's a nail.
Well, certainly in the case of sort of the buying and selling of information, I mean, people can be micro-targeted and geo-targeted with certain messages. Cambridge Analytica for the Trump campaign was very successful in doing that across the country, and so they brought together high-level metrics and analytics to essentially figure out what it is people were interested in and then target information towards their own specific interests. And that, in a way, is both good for campaigns, but also I think quite dangerous for society as a whole. The fact that everything we're doing is being tracked is, in a way, from a security standpoint, sometimes necessary, but also very problematic. And so, there's a certain reticence to look at certain information or to even self-censor when it comes to certain topics. And certainly that's the case within academia. The self-censorship, where I go, who I talk to, who I meet, could affect my visa access to the country in which I do research. So being on this panel today may have screwed me royally in that respect for China. But nonetheless,
that's most appreciated.
Nonetheless, one of the core issues is fundamentally what that data is being used for, and how it can, in a way, be used to manipulate free societies by individuals or entities that have the funds to be able to do so.
Yeah, I might add as well that, of course, the platforms are now getting a lot of pressure, of course, to be responsible for what is on their platform. This has worked in the financial industry with the different accounts, making sure that terrorists can't have just blank accounts. It is now incumbent upon finance companies and banks to make sure that they know who is investing with them and who has an account and what they are doing. Doing the same thing with the tech industry, with platforms specifically like Facebook and Twitter, to make sure that they are responsible for messages that are very much detrimental to our way of life. That is an interesting point that a lot of people have been bringing up significantly, and I'm sure we're going to see a lot more of that. The number of other questions that we had as well. Sir? Got a microphone.
Ernie Bino. We've been talking a lot about cyber defense, but to what degree could we discuss the offensive use of cyber warfare? And you're crossing ethical lines potentially. You may be provoking the opposition. You've got to be very careful. So how do we deal with that in NATO, or are we entirely defensive at this stage?
Well, understanding who the various actors are and what offensive cyber actors as well as various intelligence agencies are doing in the states that are in their area of interest. So in the Ukraine, Russia, the SVR as well as the GRU had set up various proxy networks that were essentially what one would call a sleeper cell that would then be activated once the actual troops were on the ground. And that's sort of a strategy that was very successful for the Russians. When it comes to Canada, the DND certainly is ramping up their offensive cyber capability. Whether or not it's being deployed is anyone's guess. Formerly, last year, the former director of the Canadian Security Intelligence Services talked about offensive cyber capabilities and that it might be within our sphere of interest to engage in such an action. And that was on the record in public. And so I don't think it necessarily is in all cases. We should pursue a defensive posture and to protect critical infrastructure from cyber attack. In the case of China, who had hacked the National Research Council, which houses a lot of sensitive defense intelligence and information, that's a major issue, right? Should we offensively target them if they're targeting us? Or should we change the law such that we can, in an international sense, show that they've broken international law and then prosecute them via sanctions or via some other method. In the U.S., they tried in absentia 3 Chinese military officials for cyber attacks against U.S. Based assets. That is an avenue to pursue, but again, nothing will happen to those individuals. They're continuing their work in Shanghai. So, I mean, what can be done is anyone's guess. I mean, certainly that's a discussion for our national security apparatus and for the Defense Department. I mean, I, as an observer, don't know precisely what's being done, but what should be done is to safeguard our own infrastructure and our own assets as effectively as we can.
So I think you've hit on a very, very important topic, which is that our traditional national security concepts don't appear to be working so well in cyberspace. Arms control, deterrence, and even national sovereignty and law enforcement jurisdiction, all of these things are really blurry and changing all the time, and so it's tough. And I think that you know, the Pentagon and the CIA, for example, they're probably really wondering how to respond to Russian information operations, because you know, proportionality and laws of war, discretion, and all of this also are difficult to know. How do you respond to what is essentially aggressive propaganda or something like that? It's very hard. I do think that this is a very important discussion, because how do you credibly deter it, for, let's say, for the next election in the United States? That is really an open question. You know, we don't necessarily want things to be worse in Russia, right? So that creates a difficulty for response, because there's probably a range of things that national security establishment has drawn up, but any one of them are potential pitfalls and misfires and blanks, and so it's hard. So deterrence is tough. I think retaliation is tough. One area to look at, if you're interested in this, is post Stuxnet, which was the, you know, let's say Western attack on the Iranian nuclear infrastructure. Iran also experimented with retaliation at Wall Street, Saudi Aramco, and so they were also trying to figure out how to defend their sovereignty and to retaliate, to credibly present a deterrent posture in cyberspace. So that's an interesting case study. But I would say that right now, on the U.S. side, there's a deafening silence.
I believe there are 2 ways. One is to invest more in cybersecurity, to make all networks more safe against attacks. And another way is what actually Russia has done. They went back to the typewriters to write and disseminate orders. So, and I believe that we are able. It's all about investment. That's why we need 2% of investment. Those things are, specialists are expensive, and we need to recruit the best and work to improve our security.
Sir.
Thank you. One thing I was looking at and thinking about as a straight infantry officer, and I was, along with General Ernie here, like, how do you attack? Like, defending, to me, seems like just waiting for somebody to take us on. And it strikes me that there should be somewhere, someone in some country that should actually be creating Stuxnet. And that NATO countries, or the Western nations, should actually be putting these into every single product we sell to every single country in the world, where it gets down to the point where if they try to attack, and I believe this in deterrence, this becomes mutually assured destruction. Nice aircraft you had there, shame if something were to happen to it. And all of a sudden you ignite or fire Stuxnet or whatever it might be. But this, to me, this is the battlefield of the future. And I saw, along with this, I saw something very disturbing the other day on YouTube. And it was Intel. Intel put 500 drones in the sky. And one guy with one laptop flew logos. He changed it. I mean, they flew from logos with lights on. This was done at night. And all I could think of was 500 of them with 2 ounces of explosive on each, with a little bit of a thermal imager searcher on it. That's 500 attack drones. How do we defend against that? The only way to do it is to use cyber war. We have to destroy it as soon as it lifts. We have to be able to seize control of its control systems, whether through GPS or whether we implant something in it. And I would say we shouldn't ever sell a drone or design one without having a function built in so we can take it over. So that you can't fly it into an airport. But is there some sense of it that there's this kind of importance, that we need this kind of, in the cyber world I would call it a nuclear weapon. And in fact, the man who invented the term cyber had that in his first science fiction novels. So do we have this capability? Are we looking for this? And would we be ruthless enough to shut down an entire country with it?
Anybody want to take that?
Well, I'd say part of the problem is that hardware is made in China, right? And so software is usually dependent on hardware to be able to do what it does. And so it gives China a strong advantage in this space when you build these devices. You know, when the Pentagon orders 5,000 new computers, guess where they're made? You know. And I'm sure that Chinese intelligence follows shipments very closely, right, to the U.S. government. So yeah, we do risk, I think, a corrupted global supply chain, given that even in the national security environment, IT, basically, the proper functioning of IT is required to launch a missile. Right, or to defend a airspace in a country, but we don't make the computers, and so that's going to be a tough one, right, to do that. But the Kaspersky case is very interesting. So if you follow this story, it raises not only the interesting case of whether Kaspersky might have be helping the Kremlin, but the more broadly is the fact that if you use any kind of security software, it needs to see every bit on your computer. And so you're giving essentially a blanket rights to your computer to any security software you're using. Now, what if Russia then has a spy within Symantec, right, in San Diego, right? It's cybersecurity is a strange space. I think it really is, and one that requires a lot of critical thinking. And years ago at the Pentagon, they used to say every time you sit down and write an email, remember that you're CCing Moscow and Beijing. Right? And so that goes back to the person. You have to think. And that's why, if something is really, really sensitive in government, it probably doesn't get typed into a computer, but gets written down hard copy and carried across town by courier. Because of the general distrust of computers. Yeah, I remember for the Sochi Winter Olympics, I think NBC basically made the blanket decision just to anything IT stays in Russia after the Olympics, right? The people come back, the stuff doesn't.
I'd like to thank the members of the panel